By 1927, American cities had electric refrigerators, while 90% of farms still cut ice from frozen lakes like their grandparents did. Summer heat in rural Iowa could destroy a morning's milk harvest by noon. Dairy farmers watched their income spoil in real time. No electricity meant no refrigeration. No, refrigeration meant economic devastation. A farmer could work 16 hours, milking cows only to lose everything because he had no way to keep it cold until the buyer arrived. The cruel mathematics were simple. Spoiled milk equals $0. Rotten meat equals wasted livestock. Butter turning rancid in August heat equals another month of debt. While urban Americans opened their brand new General Electric Monitor top refrigerators and stored fresh food for weeks, rural families lived in a different century entirely. The technology gap between city and country had never been wider. In 1927, the Kelvinator Company dominated urban refrigerator sales. They had been manufacturing electric refrigerators since 1918 and had refined their designs to be relatively reliable. General Electric launched the Monitor Top that same year, and it became an instant sensation among city dwellers who could afford the $525 price tag. That's equivalent to $9,000 today. The Monitor Top got its name from its distinctive appearance. The compressor sat on top of the cabinet in a cylindrical housing that resembled the gun turret on the Civil War ironclad ship USS Monitor. But price wasn't even the real barrier. The fundamental problem was infrastructure. Electric refrigerators required electricity. In 1927, only 10% of American farms had electrical service. The other 90% had nothing. No power lines, no grid connection, no hope of plugging in any modern appliance. Geography created the divide. Farms spread across vast distances made electrical infrastructure prohibitively expensive to build. Power companies focused on dense urban areas where they could serve thousands of customers per mile of wire. Rural areas offered the opposite equation: miles of wire to serve a handful of customers. The economics didn't work. Utility companies saw no profit in rural electrification, so farmers relied on methods that hadn't changed in generations. During winter, crews cut massive blocks of ice from frozen lakes and rivers. This was dangerous, backbreaking work. Men used long saws to cut through ice that could be 2 feet thick. They hauled these blocks to insulated buildings called ice houses where they packed them in sawdust. The sawdust acted as insulation to slow melting. A well-built ice house could preserve ice blocks through summer if managed carefully. The ice house had to be constructed properly with thick walls, good drainage, and minimal air circulation. Families would retrieve ice as needed and place it in wooden cabinets called ice boxes. These boxes had a compartment for ice at the top and storage space below. As icy melted, cold air sank and kept food cool for a few days. The melted water drained into a pan at the bottom that had to be emptied daily. Urban areas had regular ice delivery services. The Iceman became a fixture of city life, delivering fresh blocks to homes and businesses daily. He carried the ice with large tongs and used an ice pick to break blocks into the right size. Children followed ice wagons in summer, collecting ice chips to suck on, but rural areas had no such service. Farms were too scattered. Roads were often unpaved and impassable in bad weather. Ice delivery to remote farms made no economic sense. The result was catastrophic food loss. Studies from the period show farmers lost 25 to 40% of dairy production to spoilage. Milk soured within hours in summer heat. The bacteria that cause spoilage multiply rapidly at temperatures above 50 degrees. Without refrigeration, milk reached dangerous temperatures almost immediately after milking. Butter went rancid as the fats oxidized in warm conditions. Meat rotted as bacteria broke down the proteins. Vegetables wilted and became inedible. The waste was staggering and heartbreaking. Farmers had no choice but to sell immediately at whatever price buyers offered. This destroyed their negotiating power completely. Buyers knew farmers were desperate. They offered rock bottom prices, knowing farmers had to accept or watch their product become worthless. A dairy farmer might produce excellent milk but receive poverty wages because he had to sell within hours. The Economic impact rippled through rural communities. Lower prices meant lower farm income. Lower farm income meant less money for equipment, education, healthcare. Families couldn't afford to send children to high school. They couldn't afford doctors when someone got sick. They couldn't invest in better livestock or improved seeds. Rural poverty deepened while cities prospered. The health consequences were equally severe. Foodborne illness rates in rural areas significantly exceeded urban rates. Spoiled food caused constant sickness. Families ate questionable meat because throwing it away meant wasting precious protein. A chicken that had been dead for 2 days in summer heat was dangerous, but also represented significant food value. The calculation was terrible. Risk illness or waste food. Children suffered from contaminated milk. Dairy products are particularly dangerous when spoiled because they're ideal environments for bacterial growth. The lack of refrigeration wasn't just an economic problem. It was a public health crisis that killed children and weakened entire communities. Women bore the heaviest burden. Without refrigeration, cooking became a daily emergency. Food had to be prepared and consumed immediately. Leftovers were dangerous. A pot of stew left overnight in summer could cause severe illness. Shopping required constant trips. In rural areas, this meant traveling miles to the nearest store multiple times per week. The labor was endless and the stress immense. One day of hot weather could destroy a week's worth of food preparation. A farm wife might spend hours making butter only to watch it go rancid before she could sell or use it. The psychological toll was enormous. Rural women lived under constant pressure to prevent waste, while knowing that waste was often inevitable. Farm wives had to plan every meal around immediate consumption. They couldn't prepare food in advance. They couldn't take advantage of seasonal abundance by preserving fresh produce. Effectively, canning helped but required enormous labor and couldn't preserve dairy or meat safely. The daily grind of food management consumed hours that could have been spent on other productive work or on rest and family time. The stress contributed to the isolation and hardship that defined rural life in the early 20th century. But the technology to solve this problem existed. Refrigeration science was well understood by the 1920s. Scientists knew that removing heat from an enclosed space created cold. They understood the thermodynamic principles involved. The challenge was adapting it to work without electricity. Engineers and inventors across America began racing toward a solution. They knew the physics. Refrigeration requires removing heat from an enclosed space and expelling it elsewhere. Electric refrigerators used compression cycles with mechanical pumps. A compressor squeezed refrigerant gas, which heated up. The hot gas passed through coils where it released heat to the surrounding air. Then the gas expanded, which cooled it dramatically. The cold gas absorbed heat from inside the refrigerator. The cycle repeated continuously. These pumps required continuous electrical power. The question became how to create the same cooling effect using alternative energy sources. Several approaches emerged. Some inventors experimented with gas-powered refrigerators that burned natural gas or propane continuously. These worked but were expensive, dangerous, and required constant fuel supply. A continuous flame inside a home created fire hazards. The fuel costs added up quickly. Others explored ammonia absorption systems. These were effective but complex and hazardous if they leaked. Ammonia gas is toxic and can cause severe respiratory damage. The engineering challenge seemed insurmountable. How do you create reliable refrigeration without electricity, without continuous fuel consumption, and without complex mechanical parts that rural families couldn't repair themselves? Rural areas had few mechanics and no refrigeration specialists. Any solution had to be simple enough that farmers could operate and maintain it with minimal technical knowledge. It had to be affordable because farmers had limited cash income. It had to be safe because rural families had no access to emergency medical care. The constraints were severe. The breakthrough came from a different direction entirely. In 1927, an inventor named David Forbes Keith patented a device called the icy ball. The name sounded simple, but the engineering was elegant. Keith had solved the impossible problem. He created refrigeration without electricity, without continuous fuel consumption, and without complex mechanical parts. The icy ball consisted of two metal spheres connected by a tube. The first sphere contained a mixture of ammonia and water. The second sphere was the cold ball that you placed inside your icebox. The entire system was sealed, no moving parts, no valves, no controls beyond the external heat source. The operation was brilliantly simple. You heated the first sphere with a kerosene flame for 2 hours. The heat drove ammonia vapor out of the water solution and pushed it through the tube into the second sphere. The ammonia condensed in the second sphere as liquid. After 2 hours, you extinguished the flame and moved the cold ball into your icebox. As the liquid ammonia evaporated, it began absorbing heat from inside the icebox. This created a refrigeration effect that lasted 24 hours. Then you repeated the cycle. 2 hours of heating generated 24 hours of cooling. The efficiency was remarkable for such a simple device. The physics behind this was absorption refrigeration. When ammonia dissolves in water, it releases heat. This is an exothermic reaction. When you apply external heat, the ammonia vaporizes and separates from the water. This requires energy input. When the ammonia vapor cools and condenses back to liquid, it releases the heat it absorbed during vaporization. When the liquid ammonia evaporates again, it absorbs tremendous amounts of heat from its surroundings. This heat absorption creates cold. The phase change from liquid to gas requires substantial energy, which comes from the surrounding environment in the form of heat. The icy ball harnessed this cycle in a sealed, portable system with no moving parts. De elegance, no compressor, no motor, não tinha flame. No electricity, no complex controls, just 2 hours of heating to generate 24 hours of cooling. A farmer could heat the sphere in the morning while doing other chores, then move it to the icebox and forget about it until the next day. For farmers, without electricity, this was revolutionary. It was refrigeration they could actually use, with infrastructure they actually had. The economics were equally compelling. While electric refrigerators cost $525, the icy ball sold for $27.50. This put refrigeration within reach of ordinary farm families for the first time. A farmer could save up $27 over a season. $525 was impossible. The Crosley Radio Corporation recognized the potential immediately and began mass-producing icy ball units. Crosley was already a major manufacturer of radios and had distribution networks across rural America. They understood the farm market. They distributed through farm equipment dealers and mail-order catalogs. Sears and Montgomery Ward both carried the icy ball in their catalogs. These catalogs reached virtually every farm family in America. Rural families relied on mail order for goods they couldn't purchase locally. The Sears catalog was called the Wish Book because farm families spent winter evenings looking through it and dreaming. The icy ball appeared in these catalogs with detailed descriptions and testimonials from satisfied farmers. Between 1928 and 1975 rural America. This was substantial market penetration for a new technology in a poor, scattered market. The strongest adoption occurred in Midwest dairy regions. Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Iowa. Farmers embraced the technology because dairy spoilage was their most pressing economic problem. These states produced enormous quantities of milk, butter, and cheese. Dairy farming was the economic foundation of rural communities across the upper Midwest. Any technology that reduced dairy spoilage had immediate, measurable economic value. Farmers could calculate the return on investment easily. If the icy ball prevented the loss of even a few gallons of milk per week, it paid for itself within months. The impact on rural life was immediate and profound. Dairy farmers could now store milk safely for 2 to 3 days instead of hours. This transformed their market position fundamentally. They could wait for better prices instead of accepting whatever buyers offered. They could negotiate. They could plan. If prices were low on Monday, they could wait until Wednesday and see if they improved. This flexibility was unprecedented. The economic shift was measurable. Wisconsin dairy farmers reported income increases of 15 to 20% after acquiring refrigeration capability. That increase meant the difference between poverty and stability for thousands of families. 15 to 20% more income meant children could stay in school longer instead of leaving at 8th grade to work. It meant medical care became affordable when someone got sick. It meant debt could be paid down instead of accumulating year after year. It meant hoppy. Farm families who had lived on the edge of survival suddenly had breathing room. They could think beyond immediate survival. They could plan for the future. They could invest in improvements. Meat preservation changed completely. Before refrigeration, farmers could only butcher livestock in winter when cold weather provided natural refrigeration. Summer butchering was impossible because meat spoiled within hours. This created severe constraints on farm management. Farmers had to plan livestock production around winter butchering. They couldn't respond to market opportunities. If meat prices were high in July, they couldn't take advantage because they couldn't butcher. The icy bowl eliminated this restriction completely. Farmers could butcher year-round and preserve the meat safely. This provided better nutrition and more flexible livestock management. Families could have fresh meat in July. They could plan butchering around market prices rather than weather. If a steer reached market weight in summer, they could butcher immediately instead of feeding it for 6 more months, until winter. The flexibility was transformative. It changed the economics of livestock farming fundamentally. Vegetable storage, extended harvest season value. Farmers could pick produce at peak ripeness and store it for days instead of rushing it to market immediately. This reduced waste and improved quality. Garden vegetables that previously had to be consumed within hours could now last for days. A farm family with a large garden could harvest everything at peak ripeness and store it properly. This meant better nutrition for farm families and less pressure during harvest season. The harvest season was always frantic. Everything ripened at once and had to be processed immediately. Refrigeration spread out the work and reduced the panic. Rural stores began stocking perishable goods for the first time. Before refrigeration, country stores couldn't carry meat, dairy, or fresh produce because it would spoil before selling. Country stores served scattered populations. A customer might come once a week or less. Perishable goods would spoil between customers. The icy bowl changed this equation. Store owners could now stock perishables and serve their communities better. A country store could carry butter, eggs, fresh meat, and vegetables. This expanded the rural consumer economy. Farm families could buy fresh goods locally instead of traveling to distant towns. This saved time and transportation costs. Country stores became more viable businesses. The ripple effects extended throughout rural communities. The health improvements were dramatic and measurable. Foodborne illness rates dropped significantly in communities that adopted refrigeration. Families could store leftovers safely. They could buy in bulk. They could plan meals days in advance instead of hours. The constant threat of food poisoning decreased. Children stopped getting sick from contaminated milk. Families could eat meat in summer without risking illness. The public health impact was substantial even though it wasn't widely documented at the time. Women's daily labor burden decreased substantially. The constant pressure of immediate food preparation eased. Farm wives could cook larger batches and store leftovers. They could prepare food in advance for busy days. They could shop less frequently. The psychological relief was as important as the physical labor savings. For the first time, rural families could live with some of the same conveniences that urban families took for granted. The stress of food management decreased. The quality of life improved measurably. Farm wives reported feeling less overwhelmed. They could plan menus. They could prepare food in advance. They could rest knowing that yesterday's cooking wouldn't be wasted. This psychological shift was profound. The constant anxiety about food waste had been a defining feature of rural women's lives. Refrigeration eliminated much of that anxiety. But the icy ball had limitations that became apparent with use. The device required daily attention. You had to heat it every day without fail. Forgetting meant losing your refrigeration for that cycle. This was labor-intensive compared to electric refrigerators that required no daily intervention. The heating process took 2 hours and required monitoring. You couldn't just set it and forget it. You had to tend the kerosene flame. You had to ensure proper heating. If you didn't heat it long enough, the cooling effect was weak. If you overheated it, you could damage the seals. You had to move the cold bowl at the right time. The process required attention and created another daily chore in already busy farm schedules. The storage capacity was limited. The cold bowl could only refrigerate a small volume compared to electric units. A typical icy ball could keep about 2 cubic feet cold. That's roughly the size of a small modern mini fridge. For a large farm family, this was barely adequate. Large families or commercial operations needed multiple icy balls. This multiplied both the cost and the labor. A dairy farmer selling milk commercially might need 3, or 4 icy balls to handle his volume. Temperature consistency was another issue. The cooling effect was strongest immediately after heating and gradually weakened over the 24-hour cycle. This meant temperature fluctuated significantly. Food stored in an icy ball experienced temperature swings that electric refrigerators avoided. The cold ball might maintain 35 degrees for the first 12 hours, but drift up to 50 degrees by hour 24. This was adequate for short-term storage, but not ideal. Ammonia leaks posed occasional hazards. The system was sealed, but seals could fail over time. Metal fatigues. Connections loosen. When seals failed, ammonia gas escaped. Ammonia is toxic and has a powerful, choking odor. Even small leaks were immediately obvious because of the smell. Leaks created dangerous situations that required professional repair. Most rural areas had no one qualified to repair icy balls. The device was too new and too specialized. A leak often meant the unit was permanently disabled. The farmer had wasted $27.50, which was a substantial loss. Despite these limitations, the icy ball served its purpose remarkably well for the era. It provided refrigeration where none existed before. It worked reliably enough to transform rural economics and daily life for tens of thousands of families. It was affordable enough for ordinary farmers to purchase without going into debt. It bridged a critical gap in American infrastructure during a pivotal transition period. That gap began closing in 1935 when President Franklin Roosevelt signed the Rural Electrification Act. This landmark legislation provided federal loans and support for rural electrical cooperatives. The goal was bringing electrical service to farms across America. Roosevelt understood that rural electrification was essential for national development. The program worked with remarkable effectiveness. In 1935, 10% of farms had electricity. By 1945, 48% had power. By 1950, 90% were electrified. The transformation happened faster than anyone anticipated. The federal government provided low-interest loans to rural cooperatives. Farmers organized cooperatives to build and maintain their own electrical systems. This cooperative model proved highly effective. As power lines reached farms, the icy ball's days were numbered. Electric refrigerators were simply superior in every practical way. They required no daily heating cycle. They provided larger storage capacity. They maintained consistent temperatures automatically. They had no risk of ammonia leaks. They were more convenient in every dimension. A farm family that got electricity immediately wanted an electric refrigerator. The icy ball had taught them the value of refrigeration. Now, they wanted the best version available. Icy ball sales declined sharply in the late 1930s. By 1940, the device was mostly obsolete in electrified areas. Some extremely remote locations continued using icy balls through the 1950s, but these were exceptions. Areas that never got electrical service or where service was unreliable. Final production ceased in the early 1950s. Today, icy balls are rare collector's items and museum pieces. Antique dealers occasionally find them in old farm buildings. Museums of rural life display them as artifacts of a bygone era. The technology that bridged the gap had served its purpose and passed into history. But the icy ball's legacy extends far beyond its functional lifespan. It represented a critical category of innovation that often goes unrecognized in technological history: intermediate technology. This is technology sophisticated enough to work effectively, but simple enough to be affordable and practical in resource-constrained environments. The icy ball wasn't the ideal solution. Electric refrigeration was always superior in performance, convenience, and reliability. But the icy ball was the possible solution. It worked with the infrastructure that existed rather than waiting for the infrastructure that should exist. This pragmatic engineering solved real problems for real people in real time. The icy ball also demonstrated American ingenuity at its finest. Engineers didn't accept that rural Americans had to live without refrigeration until electrification arrived. They refused to accept a decade or more of continued suffering while infrastructure slowly expanded. They invented alternatives. They found ways to make physics work without the ideal inputs. They created solutions that were good enough to matter. The decade that the icy ball served rural America was invaluable. Those years of reduced spoilage meant better farm incomes, better nutrition, improved health, economic stability. These benefits were real and measurable even though the technology was temporary. A 15 to 20% income increase for a decade meant children received better education. It meant families built savings. It meant farms survived the Great Depression that began in 1929. The icy ball may have helped thousands of farm families stay on their land during the worst economic crisis in American history. When farm prices collapsed in the 1930s, every dollar of income mattered. The icy ball's contribution to farm income may have been the difference between survival and foreclosure for many families. The icy ball proved that rural refrigeration was economically viable and desperately needed. It built demand. Farm families who experienced refrigeration for the first time understood its value viscerally. They knew what life was like before refrigeration and what it was like after. The contrast was stark and undeniable. When electricity finally arrived, they were ready customers for electric refrigerators. They didn't need convincing. They had already lived the benefits. They knew exactly what they were buying and why it mattered. The icy ball created the market that electric refrigerators would eventually serve. This transition pattern repeated across many technologies. During the early 20th century, kerosene lamps preceded electric lights, but proved that artificial lighting transformed daily life. Farm families who used kerosene lamps understood the value of light after dark. When electricity arrived, they immediately wanted electric lights. Hand pumps preceded electric water pumps, but demonstrated that indoor plumbing was worth the investment. Battery-powered radios preceded electric radios, but showed that broadcast entertainment had enormous value. Intermediate technologies paved the way for superior technologies by demonstrating value and building demand. Other inventors pursued similar paths during this period. The Electrolux company developed gas-powered absorption refrigerators that operated continuously on propane. These found markets in areas with gas service but no electricity. Some rural areas had natural gas wells or propane distribution but no electrical grid. Serval manufactured competing gas refrigerator models that used similar principles. These technologies coexisted with the icy ball and served different niches based on local infrastructure and economics. The broader pattern was global. Australia developed similar non-electric refrigeration for remote sheep and cattle stations. The Australian outback presented even more extreme challenges than rural America. Stations were hundreds of miles from the nearest town. South Africa created alternatives for areas beyond the electrical grid. The challenge of preserving food without electricity was universal, and solutions emerged worldwide. Modern echoes of this innovation continue today. Solar-powered refrigeration serves developing nations and off-grid communities. The physics of absorption refrigeration that powered the icy ball still powers RV refrigerators and hotel minibars. Propane refrigerators use the same ammonia absorption cycle that Keith patented in 1927. The engineering principles remain relevant even as the specific applications evolve. The icy ball was one piece of a larger rural modernization that transformed American agriculture in the 1920s and 30s. Tractors replaced horses and dramatically increased farming efficiency. A farmer with a tractor could plow 5 times as much land as a farmer with horses. The tractor eliminated the need to grow feed crops for work animals. This freed up land for cash crops. Combines mechanized grain harvesting and reduced labor requirements by 90%. A combine could harvest in one day what took a crew of men a week with hand tools. Rural telephone service connected isolated farms to markets and communities. Party lines allowed farmers to coordinate sales and share information. A farmer could call the grain elevator and check prices before hauling his crop to town. Each innovation built on others to create systemic change. Refrigeration enabled the modern food distribution system that we take for granted today. Before refrigeration, food had to be consumed near where it was produced. Cities could only grow as large as nearby farms could feed them. This limited urban development and economic specialization. Refrigeration broke this geographic constraint fundamentally. Food could travel long distances without spoiling. Refrigerated rail cars moved meat from Chicago stockyards to East Coast cities. Refrigerated trucks delivered fresh produce across state lines. Cities could grow beyond the capacity of nearby farms to feed them. National food markets became possible. California produce could reach New York. Florida oranges could reach Minnesota in winter. The cold chain logistics that move food globally today began with innovations like the icy ball. Every step in modern food distribution depends on refrigeration. From farm storage to transportation to retail to home storage, the cold chain preserves food quality and safety. The icy ball was an early link in that chain. The cultural impact was equally profound. Rural isolation decreased as technology connected farms to broader society. Farm families could participate in consumer culture for the first time. They could store purchased goods. They could plan beyond immediate necessity. They could think about next week instead of just today. The psychological shift from subsistence to market participation transformed rural identity and aspiration. Subsistence farming meant producing everything you consumed. Market farming meant producing for sale and buying what you needed. This shift required different skills and created different opportunities. Farm children began imagining futures beyond farming. Education became more valuable because opportunities beyond the farm became realistic. A farm boy who could read and calculate could work in town. A farm girl with education could become a teacher. The rigid boundaries of rural life began to soften. The story of the icy ball teaches us that technology adoption is never instantaneous. There are always transition periods between old and new. These transitions create opportunities for intermediate solutions that bridge the gap. The icy ball gave farmers 10 to 15 years of refrigeration before electricity arrived. Those years mattered enormously to the families who lived them. The economic impact of reduced spoilage was immediate and substantial. The health benefits were real and measurable. The quality of life improvements were significant and deeply felt. These weren't minor gains. They were transformative for the families who experienced them. We don't remember the icy ball today because it was temporary. It was replaced by better technology and faded from collective memory. History celebrates the permanent winners and forgets the temporary solutions. Electric refrigerators are remembered. The icy ball is forgotten. But the icy ball's impact was real and its contribution was vital. Tens of thousands of farm families lived better because of it. Their children were healthier. Their incomes were higher. Their daily lives were less burdened. Their futures were more secure. The engineers who invented rural refrigeration solved an impossible problem with the tools available to them. They didn't wait for perfect conditions. They didn't wait for rural electrification to solve the problem eventually. They worked with what existed and created something that functioned well enough to matter. David Forbes Keith And the engineers at Crosley Radio Corporation deserve recognition for practical innovation that improved lives during a critical period. In 1927, America had no cold storage in rural areas. 90% of farms had no electricity and no access to refrigeration technology. Engineers didn't wait for the perfect solution of rural electrification that would take another decade or more. They invented what was possible with available resources. Refrigeration without electricity. By the time electricity arrived in the early 1940s, rural America had already learned the value of refrigeration through direct experience. The icy ball didn't just preserve food during its decade of service. It preserved the economic viability of American family farms during a critical transition period. It bridged the gap between the 19th century and the 20th. It proved that innovation doesn't require ideal conditions or perfect solutions. Sometimes the best solution is the one that works right now, with what you have. Sometimes good enough is exactly what's needed. America had no cold storage in 1927, so engineers invented rural refrigeration, and 4 kit was enough.